It was a Wednesday morning in early March of 2004 when I first noticed the shape. I was walking the southeast corner of the Dellard parcel, 41 acres I'd picked up at auction the previous fall for what most people around Haskell County considered a foolish price. The auctioneer, a man named Gerald Pruitt who'd been selling off distressed farmland in that part of central Oklahoma for going on 30 years, had looked at me over the top of his reading glasses when my paddle went up for the third time. Not a mean look. More like the look you give a man when you're pretty sure he doesn't understand what he's getting into. The land had been sitting idle since 1987, 17 years of nothing but broom sedge, eastern red cedar encroachment, and a dry creek bed that flooded every April and turned the eastern edge into something close to a bog. The previous owner, an estate handled by a bank out of Tulsa, had listed it twice before and pulled it both times. When it finally hit the block in October of 2003, there were only 3 bidders. I was the last one standing at $44,000. My son Dale thought I'd gone soft in the head. He drove out from Enid the following weekend, walked about 200 yards into the property with his hands in his coat pockets, turned around and said, "Dad, there's nothing here." He wasn't wrong exactly. There wasn't much to look at. The cedars along the western fence line had grown in so thick you couldn't see through them. The old homestead, whatever had been there, had been pulled down or collapsed sometime before my memory. There was a concrete foundation ring near the road, mostly buried, and a rusted stock tank sitting tilted in the northeast corner like it had given up trying to stand straight. The soil along the creek bottom was heavy clay, the kind that cracks like old pottery in July and holds your boot in February. But something about it had stayed with me since the first time I walked it, back in September of 2003, when the estate bank was still deciding whether to list it at all. I couldn't have told you what exactly, not then. I'd been farming in Haskell County since 1979. Before that, I'd worked my father's place up in Woodward County, which is where I grew up. My father died in 1981, 2 years after I left, and my mother sold the Woodward property to a neighbor and moved into town. I never quite forgave myself for not being there when he passed. He'd had a bad heart for years, and we all knew it was coming, but knowing something is coming and being ready for it are two different things entirely. My wife Ruth passed in November of 1999, pancreatic cancer. She was gone in 4 months from diagnosis to burial. We had 31 years together, which I consider about the greatest luck a man can have, and I try not to dwell on the rest of it. But after she went, I had a tendency to keep myself busy in ways that weren't always practical. Buying the Dellard parcel probably fell somewhere in that category. My daughter-in-law Corinne was more diplomatic than Dale about it. She said, "Well, Floyd, you've always had a good eye for land," which I appreciated, even if I knew she didn't entirely believe it either. My neighbor to the south, an old boy named Terrence Eggert who ran a wheat and cattle operation on about 1,800 acres and had been farming that stretch of Haskell County since before I arrived, stopped by the week after the auction and sat on my porch for about an hour drinking coffee. He didn't say much. Finally, he set down his cup and said, "That Dellard ground's been beat on pretty hard. Whoever put a plow to it back in the 40s didn't know when to quit." I asked him what he knew about the place. He shrugged. "Not much. Some family had it. Tried to grow cotton on clay ground which never made sense. Was a fella ran it for a while after them, can't think of his name, and then it just kind of sat." That was all he offered. I didn't push. So on that Wednesday morning in March of 2004, I was out there with no particular plan other than to start clearing cedar saplings along the western fence line. I had a chainsaw in the truck and a pair of loppers, and I figured I'd work until about noon, and then drive into Stigler and pick up some fence staples I'd been putting off buying. The grass was still winter brown, beaten flat by the wet we'd had in February. The soil under my boots was soft in that particular way it gets in early March, not quite thawed through, not quite muddy, somewhere between the two. I was about 40 yards in from the southern fence when I saw it. You have to understand, I almost didn't stop. My mind was on the cedar situation and whether I had enough bar oil in the truck. But something about the way the light was hitting the ground. We'd had an overcast morning that had just started to break up, and there was low-angle sunlight coming in from the southeast. Something about it made a particular patch of ground look different from everything around it. It was a shape. Not a dramatic shape. Not something that would stop you in your tracks. If you'd been walking fast or if the light had been different, you'd have missed it entirely. But in that low morning light, with the dead grass pressed flat, you could see a kind of rectangle. Maybe 30 feet long, maybe 12 or 14 feet wide. The grass inside the rectangle was very slightly lower than the grass around it, and there was a subtle difference in the color of the soil at the edges. Just the faintest darkening, the kind you see when the earth has been disturbed, and then settled, and then had decades of weather work on it. I stood there for a moment. Then I walked around it. The more I looked, the less sense it made. My first thought was a septic system, but that didn't track. The shape was too long and too uniform, and it was oriented in a specific direction, running almost exactly north to south, which didn't suggest any kind of utility installation I'd seen before. My second thought was an old roadbed. We had plenty of those in Haskell County, old wagon tracks and pre-county road paths that had been plowed over or abandoned, and sometimes showed up in dry years as faint lines in a field. But this wasn't dry weather. We'd had 6 inches of rain in February alone, and an old roadbed wouldn't have that clean rectangular edge. I walked the perimeter twice. The long sides were straight, not perfectly straight but intentionally straight, the way a foundation is straight versus the way a creek bank is straight. I went back to the truck and got a steel probe rod I kept in the bed for checking soil depth. Started pushing it into the ground at the corners, then along the edges. At the corners, the probe hit resistance at about 14 inches. In the middle of the rectangle, it went down close to 36 inches before it hit anything solid. Along one of the long edges, the eastern one, I hit something at about 8 inches that had a different feel to it. Not rock, not pure clay, something that gave very slightly when I pushed, then held. Old wood. It had the feel of old wood. I pulled the probe out and looked at the tip. There was a faint dark stain on it, the color of old charred timber, and a smell that was hard to describe. Something between rot and smoke and wet earth. I should have gone and gotten my chainsaw like I'd planned. Instead, I went back to the truck and got the short-handled spade. I want to be clear that I didn't expect to find anything significant. I've been farming long enough to know that the ground holds all manner of old junk, plow parts, fence wire, glass bottles, the occasional piece of equipment that somebody buried rather than hauled off. I've pulled cast iron stove lids out of a wheat field and a Model A rear axle out of a creek bank. Land in Haskell County has been worked by a lot of different hands over a lot of years, and most of what's underground is mundane. So I started digging at the eastern edge, where I'd felt the wood, just curious. The topsoil was about 7 inches of silty loam, better than I'd expected for that corner of the property, actually, and then it transitioned to that heavy red clay. I'd gone down maybe 10 inches and moved about 2 feet laterally when the spade hit something solid, and I heard a sound I wasn't expecting. Not the thud of rock. Not the scrape of old iron. More like the sound you get when you tap on the lid of a wooden box that still has some integrity left in it. Hollow. I set down the spade and got on my knees and started moving soil with my hands. What I found at first was the edge of a plank. Wide plank, rough cut, old-growth timber from the look of it, the kind of dense, tight-grained wood that used to come out of the sawmills in the eastern part of the state back in the early part of the last century. This plank was running north to south along the edge of the rectangle, and it was standing on its edge, not lying flat, set vertically into the ground like a wall board. I followed it north about 4 feet before my knees gave out, and I stood up and stretched my back. I looked at what I'd uncovered, a wall, a buried wooden wall. Not the remains of a collapsed structure sitting on the surface and slowly sinking. This thing had been constructed below grade, intentionally below grade. Whatever this was, somebody had dug a hole and built it in the hole and then, at some point, covered it over. The question I kept turning over as I stood there brushing clay off my hands was, when? The wood was dark with age and moisture, but it hadn't rotted through. Whatever species it was, and I suspected Boy's dark, which is the toughest wood that grows in this part of Oklahoma and will outlast almost anything, it had held its shape. But the soil over it had a settled, undisturbed character that you learn to read after enough years of working ground. This wasn't recent. This wasn't even from my generation. This was old. I drove into Stigler that afternoon as I'd planned, but I didn't buy fence staples. Instead, I stopped at the county clerk's office on East Main and asked if they had the deed history on the Dellard parcel going back to original land patent. The woman at the front desk, young woman, very efficient, I don't remember her name, looked it up and printed me a chain of title that went back to the territorial period. I sat in my truck in the parking lot and read through it twice. The land had been originally patented in 1902 under the Oklahoma Organic Act to a man whose name I had to read 3 times before I was sure I was reading it right. Elias Cutter Dellard. That name. I'd heard that name before, and it took me the better part of the drive home to remember where. My father had mentioned it, not in any significant way, not as a story, not as something important, just in the way that older people drop names sometimes, names that meant something in a community at a particular time that then get worn smooth and eventually disappear. My father had grown up in Woodward County, but he'd done some work in Haskell County in the mid-1940s, driving a grain truck for a co-op operation out of Stigler. He must have been in his early 20s then. And I had a memory, a thin memory, the kind that you're not entirely sure is real, of him mentioning a name. Dellard. Something about a man who had built something on his property and then lost everything in the drought years, and nobody ever found out what became of it. I wasn't certain enough of that memory to trust it completely, but it was there. When I got home that evening, I called my sister Marjorie in Woodward, who is 81 years old now and has a memory like a steel trap, and I asked her if she remembered Dad ever mentioning anyone named Dellard. There was a long pause. She said, "Floyd, why are you asking about that?" Marjorie remembered more than I did. She's 11 years older than me, and she actually knew our father as an adult, the way you don't when you're the youngest. She said that Dad had mentioned a man named Dellard, Elias Dellard, on more than one occasion when she was a teenager, which would have put it in the early 1950s. He described him as a man who had been, in her words, ahead of his time in certain ways and behind it in others. She said our father had spoken of him with a kind of complicated respect, the kind you have for someone who tried something that didn't work out. She didn't know the details. She said Dad had a small notebook, a red-covered composition notebook, that he'd kept from his time working in Haskell County. She'd seen him look at it occasionally over the years. She thought our mother might have thrown it out after he passed, but she wasn't certain. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning I called my mother's old neighbor in Woodward, a woman named Bet Harkins, whose husband had helped settle up my mother's house when she'd moved into the retirement community in 1993, and asked if she remembered anything being set aside from my parents' effects. Old papers, notebooks, anything like that. Bet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know, Floyd, I believe I put a box of your father's papers in my attic. Your mother asked me to hold them, and nobody ever came for them." I was in Woodward by Friday afternoon. The box was a standard banker's box, cardboard, dusty in the way that only decades of attic storage produces. Bet brought it down from the pull-down stairs herself, which impressed me for a woman of her age, and set it on her kitchen table and left me to it while she made coffee. Most of the contents were what you'd expect: old tax records, a warranty deed from a piece of property my parents had sold in 1968, a bundle of letters from my father's time in the army, which I set aside without opening because that felt like something for another day. And then, near the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of brown grocery sack paper and held with a rubber band that disintegrated when I touched it, a red composition notebook. It was smaller than I remembered from Marjorie's description, maybe 4 inches by 6. The cover faded to more of a rust color than a true red. My father's name was on the inside front cover in his careful block printing: Harold Gene Burch, Stigler, Oklahoma, 1944-1946. I sat at Bet Harkin's kitchen table for 2 hours reading it. My father was not a literary man. The notebook was mostly logistical: grain weights, delivery routes, names of farms he serviced, notes about road conditions. The kind of running record a careful man keeps when his livelihood depends on keeping track of things. But there were occasional longer entries, written in a slightly different hand, like he'd had more time to sit and write carefully. One of those longer entries was dated September 14th, 1945. I'm going to try to summarize what he wrote rather than reproduce it word for word, partly because his handwriting was difficult, and partly because some of it was personal in ways that weren't mine to share. But the substance of it was this. He had made a delivery to a farm southeast of Stigler. The route description matched exactly where the Dellard parcel sat, and the old man there, who he identified as E. Dellard, had invited him in for a meal. My father wrote that Dellard was old then, maybe 70 or older, which would put his birth year somewhere around 1875. He'd been farming that land since before statehood. He'd survived the First World War, the Depression, the drought years of the 1930s, and he was still there in 1945, living alone. His wife had died sometime in the early 1930s. His 2 sons had gone to California during the Dust Bowl years and not come back. My father wrote that Dellard was a quiet man, not suspicious but careful. He'd shown my father around the property after they ate, and at one point had taken him to the southeast corner, the exact corner where I'd found the shape in the grass, and had pointed at the ground and said something that my father had written down as close to verbatim as he could manage. He'd said, "I built this for the dry years. Figured out that what the ground keeps cool, the ground keeps good. When my boys come back, they'll know where it is." My father had written. He didn't say more than that, and I didn't ask. The old man had a way of finishing a subject. That was the entry. That was it. I drove back to Haskell County on Saturday morning and walked straight out to the southeast corner of the Dellard parcel. The shape in the grass was still there, of course. It doesn't take long to recognize something once you know to look for it. I walked the full perimeter again, this time with my father's words in my mind, and the more I looked, the more I understood what I was seeing. This wasn't a collapsed structure. It wasn't an old basement in the usual sense. The dimensions, 30 feet by about 13, oriented north to south, were consistent with something I'd read about but never actually encountered. A root cellar of the kind that the early homesteaders in this part of Oklahoma had built in the 1910s and 1920s, before electric refrigeration, to store produce and preserved goods through the summer heat. They were common enough in the hill country to the east, but out here on the open plains where the water table was different and the soil conditions made deep excavation difficult, a structure this large and apparently this well built was unusual. The phrase Dellard had used, "What the ground keeps cool, the ground keeps good," wasn't a metaphor. It was engineering. He had built a large underground cold storage facility, by hand, presumably, or with whatever team he could put together, on a piece of land that sat in a natural low spot, where the temperature differential between the surface and 8 feet down would have been significant even in August. But why cover it over? I spent the better part of a week going back and forth to the county clerk's office, the County Historical Society, which operates out of a small room in the back of the Carnegie Library in Stigler, staffed by a woman named Donna Farrell, who has probably forgotten more about Haskell County history than most people ever learn, and the county assessor's records going back to the territorial period. Donna was the one who found the key piece. She pulled a file on the Dellard property that included a carbon copy of a letter from the county extension office dated August 1952. The letter was addressed to an attorney in Tulsa who was apparently handling the Dellard estate. Elias Dellard had died in June of 1952, alone on the property, at what the death record listed as approximately 77 years of age. The letter referenced a dispute about the property's value for estate purposes. The county assessor had valued it at a certain figure. The estate attorney was contesting that figure upward on the basis of improvements made to the property by the decedent. The extension office had been asked to evaluate those improvements. Their response was 2 paragraphs long, and it was blunt in the way that institutional correspondence sometimes is. The evaluating agent, a man named R.H. Stowell, had written that the subsurface storage structure on the southeast corner of the property was of no commercial value under current agricultural practices, given that electric refrigeration had made such structures obsolete and unmarketable. He had further noted that the structure's wooden construction and burial depth made it a potential liability, and recommended it be decommissioned. The estate attorney had apparently accepted this assessment, and the property had been valued accordingly, low, and eventually sold at that low figure to a farming operation that had used it as pasture for about 15 years before selling it again. Nobody had decommissioned anything. They had just forgotten it was there. I want to tell you what I found when I finally opened it, because that's the part that has stayed with me. It took me the better part of 3 days to do it properly. I didn't want to damage anything, and I didn't want to go in before I understood the structural situation. The first day I spent probing and mapping the full footprint, confirming that the walls were intact along all 4 sides. The second day, I brought a come-along and some rigging equipment and my neighbor Terrence Eggert, who I'd told about the whole situation over the phone, and who showed up with a bottle of Gatorade and a look of cautious interest that was about the highest compliment he knew how to pay. We found the access point on the north end, a set of wide wooden steps, covered over with a single heavy plank that had been backfilled with about a foot of soil. The plank was boys dark, as I'd suspected. It had weathered, but it had not failed. Terrence looked at it for a long time. He finally said, "That old man built to last." We rigged the come-along to a fence post and pulled the cover plank clear, and the smell that came up out of the opening was something I have tried to describe to people and never quite managed. It was cool air, noticeably cooler than the March afternoon above ground, and it carried the smell of old wood and earth, and something faintly sweet that I eventually decided was the residue of dried fruit or preserves, some aromatic memory of what the structure had once held, preserved in the airless dark for decades. We went down the steps carefully, testing each one before putting weight on it. The structure was intact. I don't want to overstate what was inside, because the physical contents were not what made it meaningful. There were wooden shelving units along both long walls, built with the same careful joinery as the outer walls. Most of the shelves held nothing, or held the remains of nothing, organic matter that had long since dried to dust, and the shadows of shapes that might once have been jars or bins or sacks. On the northern wall there was a set of hooks, heavy iron hooks set into a cross beam, of the kind you'd use to hang cured meat. On the eastern wall, on the middle shelf about chest height, there were 3 objects that had survived intact. The first was a glass mason jar, sealed, containing what appeared to be dried seeds. The lid had a faint orange rust along the seal but had not failed. The seeds inside, I later had them identified by the Extension Office, which took some explaining, were a variety of heirloom sorghum that had been largely displaced by commercial hybrid varieties by the 1950s. Open-pollinated, drought-tolerant, the kind of seed stock that had sustained families through the worst of the dry years. The second was a folded piece of oilcloth, stiff with age, that when I carefully unfolded, it turned out to be a hand-drawn map of the Dellard property and the surrounding sections, annotated in a small, precise hand. The annotations marked water sources, springs, seeps, a seasonal pond in the northwest corner of the property that I had walked right past without recognizing for what it was. They marked soil types with simple symbols. They marked the locations of several other structures on adjacent properties, some of which I later determined had been the locations of homesteads that were now entirely gone. The third object was a small tin box, the kind that might have held tobacco. Inside the tin box was a folded piece of paper, and on the paper, in the same precise hand as the map, were two sentences. For whoever finds this, from E.C. Dellard, the land is not worthless, you have to know where to look. I've thought about those two sentences more times than I can count in the years since. Not because they're profound in any literary sense. They're not. They're the words of a practical man stating a practical fact. But the circumstances that produced them, an old man, alone on his land, his sons gone to California and not coming back, knowing he was going to die with nobody to pass his knowledge to, taking the time to write that note and put it in a tin box and leave it on a shelf in the dark, that's something I return to. He didn't know if anyone would ever find it. The note wasn't addressed to his sons. It was addressed to whoever. He was speaking to a stranger. He was speaking to me. Terence Eggert stood in that underground room for a long time without saying anything. Terence is not a sentimental man, and I would not have expected him to be moved by it. But when we came back up the steps into the afternoon light, he stood with his hands in his pockets looking at the hole we'd opened up, and he said, "I've farmed this county for 40 years, and I didn't know this was here." I said, "Neither did I." He nodded. That extension agent in 1952 called it worthless. I said he was thinking about what it had been, not what it could be. Terence thought about that for a moment. What are you going to do with it? I hadn't decided yet, but I had some ideas. The seed jar went to the seed library at Oklahoma State University Extension in Stillwater, where a woman named Dr. Patricia Hughes, a plant geneticist who specializes in pre-hybrid sorghum varieties, told me it was, in her professional opinion, a genuinely significant find. She said the variety appeared to be a strain that had been widely grown in southeastern Oklahoma between about 1910 and 1940 and was believed to be essentially lost. She was careful about it, the way scientists are, said they'd need to test viability and do proper propagation trials. But she shook my hand with both of hers when I left, which I took as a good sign. They got germination. I won't belabor the technical details, but the short version is that those seeds, held in the dark and the cool of that underground room for 50-some years, were still alive. Some of them anyway. Enough. The map I donated to the Haskell County Historical Society, where Donna Farrell had it professionally conserved and framed. It now hangs on the wall of that small back room in the Carnegie Library. I've been told it's the most detailed hand-drawn survey of that particular section of the county, from the homestead period, that anyone has ever documented. Dellard had noted things on it that no official record captured: the locations of seasonal water sources, the patterns of soil transition, the topographic features that affected drainage. Knowledge that took decades to accumulate, and that he'd recorded with enough care that it was still legible 100 years later. The structure itself I restored. It took me about 8 months of weekends and the help of my son Dale, who had initially told me the land was worthless and who became, once he saw what was down there, considerably more interested in the project. We reinforced the walls with pressure-treated lumber sistered against the original bois d'arc, replaced the cover boards, installed a proper ventilated access door, and leveled the floor. By the fall of 2005, it was sound again. I use it for cold storage now. Root vegetables mostly, potatoes, sweet potatoes, turnips, winter squash. It maintains a temperature of about 52 degrees Fahrenheit through the summer without any mechanical assistance. In July, when it's 104 degrees in the shade above ground, I go down those stairs and the cool air comes up to meet me, and I think about Elias Dellard figuring this out with a hand level and a spade and nothing but time and observation. The seasonal pond that Dellard had marked on his map in the northwest corner of the property turned out to be fed by a subsurface spring that I would likely never have identified on my own. Once I knew where to look, once I had his map, I could see how the ground surface cupped slightly around it, and how the grass in that area stayed green about 2 weeks longer in August than the grass around it. I cleaned out the vegetation that had grown in, dug the channel deeper, and now that corner of the property has reliable water for cattle 8 months out of the year. That was the piece that made the Dellard parcel make sense as a farming operation. Without the spring, you were trying to raise cattle on rainfall alone in a part of Oklahoma that averages about 44 inches a year, but takes most of it in the spring and doesn't apologize for the summer. With the spring, you had options. Dellard had known that. He'd marked it on a map and put the map in the dark on a shelf and trusted that someone, eventually, would have the sense to come looking. I never found out what happened to his sons, the ones who'd gone to California during the Dust Bowl and hadn't returned. I looked, after a fashion, wrote a letter to a genealogical research organization in Tulsa, and had a woman named Geraldine Mays do some searching in California death records, but the trail went cold somewhere around 1960. 2 men named Dellard with approximate birth years in the 1910s, and a last known location of somewhere in the San Joaquin Valley. They could have changed names, changed states, died young, lived long. I don't know. I like to think at least one of them lived a full life. I have no particular reason to think that, but I don't have reason to think otherwise either, so I choose it. Dale asked me once, maybe a year after we'd finished the restoration work, whether I thought the previous owners had known about the underground room and just not mentioned it, or whether it had genuinely been forgotten. I told him I thought it had genuinely been forgotten, that in 1952, when the estate was being settled, the phrase subsurface storage structure of no commercial value was probably accurate in the context of what people were thinking about then. Rural electrification had reached most of Haskell County by the late 1940s. People had refrigerators. A hand-built underground root cellar was a thing of the past, not the future. The extension agent wasn't wrong given the assumptions he was working with. Dale thought about that, he said, so the land wasn't worthless, the knowledge was just lost. That's about right. That's exactly right, actually. I am not a man who draws large lessons from small events. I've farmed long enough to be suspicious of the kind of thinking that turns a rusted fence post into a metaphor. The land does what it does. The weather does what it does. You work with what you have and you try to pay attention, and you try not to miss the things that are sitting right in front of you. But I will say this. That March morning in 2004, when I walked out into the southeast corner of the Dellard parcel and stood in the low eastern light and looked at the shape in the dead grass, that was a moment that changed the way I thought about what land holds and what it loses, and what it's waiting to give back to someone patient enough to look. Gerald Prout, the auctioneer, saw me at a sale up in McIntosh County about a year after I'd bought the Dellard place. He asked how the southeast parcel was working out. I told him it was working out fine. He raised his eyebrows a little and said, "Well, I'll be darned." That was the extent of the conversation. He had no idea what had been under that ground. Neither had I, until I slowed down enough to notice the shape of the thing. The soil smells different in March than it does any other month. It's hard to describe to someone who hasn't worked ground for a long time. Something between winter and something else, something that's just beginning to wake up. I was out in that corner of the property just last week. I'm 71 years old now, and I don't move as fast as I used to, but I still walk that ground a few times a year. And I stood at the top of the access steps and let the cool air come up, and I thought about an old man in 1945 showing a young grain truck driver the ground he'd built something in, and saying with a kind of plain certainty that whatever he'd put down there, his boys would know where to find it. His boys didn't come back, but somebody came. Took about 60 years, which is longer than Dellard probably hoped. But the door held. The seeds held. The knowledge held. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the structure, not the seeds, not even the map, though the map was remarkable. What keeps coming back to me is the act of making something carefully enough and documenting it thoroughly enough that it survives you by decades and still makes sense to a stranger who finds it by accident in the low March light. Elias Cutter Dellard didn't build that room for posterity. He built it for his sons and for the dry years, and for the practical reason that the ground keeps cool what the ground keeps good. But what he left behind ended up being more than cold storage. It was a lesson in looking, in not taking somebody else's word for what a thing is worth, in understanding that the people who came before you on a piece of ground weren't necessarily ignorant just because they're gone. My father never went back to Haskell County after his time driving the grain truck, but he kept that notebook for 35 years and never threw it out, which tells me something. There was a reason he held on to it. There was a reason he mentioned Dellard's name to my sister in the early 1950s with that complicated respect. He'd met a man who understood something about land and permanence that my father recognized even if he couldn't fully articulate it. And something about that recognition stayed with him long enough to matter, long enough to end up in a box in Bet Harkin's attic, long enough to find its way to me on a Friday afternoon in the spring of 2004, when I had enough sense to drive to Woodward and ask a simple question. The land is not worthless. You have to know where to look. I've been looking for 22 years since that morning in the southeast corner, and I'm still not sure I've seen everything that ground has to show me. But I'm paying attention. That much I can say. I'm paying attention.